A shepherd was tending his flock in a field when a new sports car screeched to a stop on the road nearby. The driver, a man in expensive designer clothes and sunglasses, leans out the window and shouts over to the shepherd, "If I can tell you exactly how many sheep you have here, can I take one?" The shepherd looks up slowly at the man, looks out at his peaceful flock and his herding dog, and calmly answers, "Sure, why not?" The young man steps out of the car holding the state-of-the-art palm-sized computer with which he proceeds to connect to a series of satellites, calling up the satellite navigation system to pinpoint his location, then keying into that location to generate a high-resolution picture of the field. After emailing that photo into an image processing facility, the data is returned, and he then feeds that data into an online database, enters the parameters for a report. Within another few seconds, the miniature printer in the car starts producing a string of full-color printouts containing several pages of analysis and results. The young man studies the data for a few minutes and then returns to the shepherd. "You have exactly 1,586 sheep, including 3 rams and 722 lambs." "That's right," said the shepherd, mildly impressed. "Well, I guess that means you get to take one of my sheep." The man, feeling confident, agrees. And he makes his choice, loads the animal into the back seat of the car, at which point the shepherd says, almost as an afterthought, "Hey there, if I can tell you what your business is, will you give me my sheep back?" The man agrees again. "You're a consultant," says the shepherd. "Wow, that's right," said the man, taken aback. "How did you guess that?" "No guessing required," said the shepherd. "You showed up here even though nobody called you. You took a fee for giving me an answer that I already knew to a question that I never asked, and you know nothing about my business. Now give me back my dog."
Stand as you are able for hymn 21, for the beauty of the earth. For the can tell you already all know that our speaker has a sense of humor. And we are very much appreciative of that. She is, just for a very brief bio here, she's an artist and a self-professed, I think, plant geek, garden geek. And she got pulled into garden communications at one point in her life. So she's the author of several books, 8 books, I think, one of which is about gardening on Martha's Vineyard. So if you are a gardener, you should look for that book. And another one which has some comments about the vineyard. She's a professional speaker, the host of Garden Line on the radio, and a Plantama broadcast. She tells me that her broadcast listeners say that the CL of her name stands for compost lover. So you can see she has a definite sense of humor from all the way along. She's a frequent speaker to groups nationwide and has worked for a family-owned garden center on the Cape and grows her own trees and shrubs and flowers and vegetables. I love the name of her home there, Poison Ivy Acres on Cape Cod. You can connect with her at worldwideweb.gardenlady.com. CL. We're ready for some more laughs. I've been saying since she was contracted to come here that her topic, which is invasive plants and humans, really sits with me, being an environmentalist. We'll see what she has to say.
When I moved to Cape Cod, I looked for a book about gardening in the area, and I couldn't find one. The closest that I came was a book called Gardening by the Sea, which was not just about the Cape, but covered gardening pretty much over the East Coast. I bought that book and I began to read it, and I soon realized that it was seriously out of date. I could tell because it recommended kudzu as being a good plant for the garden. We now know, of course, that kudzu is an invasive plant. It grows so thickly over shrubs and trees that it blocks the light and it kills them. So far, it has made a few entrances into Massachusetts and has indeed been spotted here on the vineyard. And we need to be, of course, alert for it, because as our world gets warmer, the kudzu is going to get stronger here. When that book, Gardening by the Sea, was written, people did not understand the danger invasive plants that they posed. Many plants were commonly sold as good garden plants and landscape specimens. Like kudzu, they've proven to be a problem in the wild. Kudzu, is kind of similar to bittersweet. We have bittersweet here. I'm sure a lot of you pull that out of your gardens and your property here on the vineyard. And Rosa multiflora, the wild rose. Both bittersweet and Rosa multiflora were brought to this country as plants for the landscape. The berries on the bittersweet are pretty. Rosa multiflora is so fragrant when it's in flower that many people, when they smell it, ask if they can have one in their gardens. Both of these plants, see, this is like a speaker's nightmare. Finally, text. Both of these plants are now illegal to sell in the state of Massachusetts, not that people are clamoring to buy them. People do still want to buy barberry and burning bush. Those two plants were declared invasive about 18 to 20 years ago, banned in Boston and the rest of Massachusetts as well. When people move to this state from other areas where these are still sold, they are surprised to hear that they can't plant that red-foliaged barberry that is so drought tolerant. And they ask why the burning bush, so easy to grow and so colorful in the fall, cannot be purchased here. Sometimes they say, well, I grew this plant for years and never had a problem with it. They should have looked carefully under their shrubs and trees on their neighbor's property, however, or on the edges of nearby woodlands. Here's the definition of invasive species: animals, plants, or other organisms introduced by people into places out of their natural range of distribution, where they become established and dispersed, generating a negative impact on the local ecosystem and species. In the state of Massachusetts, another requirement for being labeled invasive is that the plants spread by seeds. When a plant spreads by seeds, it can cross boundaries and appear a mile away. The seeds of invasive plants are often spread by birds, and the resulting offspring choke out native plants. The key words are many of them, because not all invasive plants, or not all invasive plants choke out native plants. Some do and some don't. The Rosa multiflora grows very nicely in combination with our native holly. It's good that people become more educated about both invasive and native plants, and it's great to understand how being introduced, how we may, innocently introduce a plant, but then it causes disruptions in bird, insect, and other wildlife populations as a result. The public has become more educated about this and aware of it, partly because of the publicity about the decline of bees and butterflies and other insects in the world. Supporting pollinators is becoming part of our popular culture, and that's a good thing. Homeowners want to devote sections of their landscape to being a pollinator pathway with native plants that support insects and animals. And if you're interested in knowing more about that effort, you can Google Pollinator Pathway Cape Cod, and you will come up with the Cape group that is part of that movement. But as in many other human endeavors, we Homo sapiens have a tendency to get things wrong as we try and make things right. Who here has battled that thorny greenbrier in their yards and gardens? Anybody? Yeah. It's called bullbrier, or greenbrier, or catbrier, or that blankety blank blank fine. Its botanic name is Smilax roundifolia. Go to many conservation areas on the Cape and Islands, and you can barely walk off the trails because of those thorny green vines. Every year on my property, I notice some rhododendron or other shrub that I've got has that Smilax growing up in it, and I have to crawl underneath and curse at it as I cut them off. The greenbrier is prolific, annoying, and it has a root system that rivals the Verizon network. This leads many to assume that it is an invasive plant, but that is not the case. Smilax roundifolia is a native plant, and by definition, a native plant cannot be labeled invasive. In fact, the greenbrier produces berries that many birds depend on, and leaves that deer and other mammals eat. And the thorny stems provide shelter for other animals as they hide because they are naturally prey. This plant is prolific, it's bothersome, but it can't accurately be called invasive. There's a difference between a plant that's invasive and one that's just aggressive. I did a garden consultation last year for somebody who was regretting having planted spiderwort in her garden. It's so invasive, she moaned. I agreed that this plant, Tradescandia virginiana, is commonly called spiderwort, and it is annoying because it spreads quickly and it looks messy after it finishes flowering. I agreed that it's aggravating, but the plant is a native plant and cannot be called invasive. It is aggressive, but it's not invasive. Remember that the definition of an invasive is an organism introduced by people into places out of their native range where they generate a negative effect on the local ecosystem and species. What about crabgrass? Maybe you're annoyed by crabgrass currently flourishing in your lawn or garden. Humorist David Barry once wrote that crabgrass can grow on bowling balls in airless rooms, and there is no way to kill it that does not involve nuclear weapons. Now, I personally don't care about it in my lawn. My lawn, whatever grows there is welcome. But I do get peeved when I have to repeatedly pull it out of my vegetable garden paths and flower beds. And between you and me, if I had a magic wand and could instantly rid my property of crabgrass, I would use that wand with glee. Crabgrass is not invasive, but it is a persistent, strong weed. This plant, believe it or not, was actually brought to this country as a grain crop. Settlers coming from Eastern Europe knew that this plant would grow anywhere. And it was a good foraging plant as well as a grain crop. And so they brought it to North America, where they discovered there were other better plants for foraging and for grain. And so they left the crabgrass to thrive in the wild and cultivated landscapes for centuries to come. Not everyone transports seeds for food and sustenance. Some do it for the love of a plant or the appreciation of beauty. My own mother, for example. Shortly after Dan and I moved to Cape Cod in '93, my mother visited from her home in Wisconsin. It was in the fall, and when my boys were in school, my mom and I drove around the area so that we could explore Cape Cod together. As we drove down Route 6A one day, the low autumn sun was illuminating the plumes of the reeds alongside the road. "Pull over," my mom said. "This is so beautiful." I parked the car and we admired those glowing grasses. And then my mom pulled a few seeds off of the plume and put them in her purse. "I want to see if these will grow in Wisconsin," she said. She was talking about the Phragmites. Yes, the invasive plant that clogs our waterways. Since I was new to this area, I was not familiar with the plant. I had no idea it was a huge problem. And since she was from Wisconsin and had not seen Phragmites, she was just captured by how beautiful it looked in the setting sun. Fortunately, none of the seeds that she took back grew. She lived on a lake at that time. I'm not sure I could stand being the invasive plant equivalent of Typhoid Mary in Wisconsin. Although Phragmites Fornari has a certain alliteration to it. Fortunately, they did not grow. People have carried seeds, cuttings, bare roots, and potted plants across centuries around the world as long as they have known that plants can be transported. And for better or worse, that's what we have done, sometimes unintentionally. I read a report a few years ago about invasive plants in the outback of Australia. In this very inhospitable land where no tourists and few Australians go, people wondered how exotic plants were being spread there. Well, it turned out that the seeds of those plants were being spread, brought in by people on the shoes and the cuffs of the pants of the scientists who were going there to study a land where invasive plants should not be growing. Not all exotic plants are invasive, of course. Many grow perfectly well in community with our native plants. Many also support pollinators, especially in times of year when there aren't as many pollen or nectar sources. that are available from native flowers. You'll frequently hear people saying, oh, you should leave the dandelions in your lawn for early foraging bees. Fine advice, except the dandelion isn't a native plant here. It comes from Eurasia. And it's not even a great support plant for our native insects. But people see these bright yellow flowers in the spring, and that causes them to assume that the dandelions are pollen-rich. When it comes to pollinators, our assumptions get us into trouble, just like our assumptions get us into trouble about invasive plants. What comes to your mind when you think of pollinators? For most people, it's bees, right? Most people think about saving the bees, and yes, bees are pollinators and provide nectar and pollen for them in our local environments is crucial, but bees are only a fraction of the beings that pollinate plants. People like to think about hummingbirds and butterflies and bees and being part of the efforts to support them, but along with those bees and butterflies and hummingbirds, those critters that make us think of Disney cartoons are other insects and animals that are critical for pollination, and they are less warm and fuzzy. Moths, for example, wasps, beetles, spiders, ants, flies, and bats. I recently got a question from a Plant Rama podcast listener who took great pride in having a native pollinator pathway in his city. But he was bothered by the flies that were coming into the garden because they would make their way into his house. How can we get rid of the flies, was his question. Our answer to him, I'm sure he did not want to hear, was that he needs to remember that flies are pollinators too. We say we want native plants, but we have to acknowledge that some of them are thorny and annoying. We have to acknowledge that some of those native plants give us a rash if we come in contact with them. We say we want to support pollinators, but then we need to be ready to embrace not only the fuzzy bees and the beautiful butterflies, but the creepy crawly and the bothersome. Which brings me, after all of this plant talk, to the heart of this sermon, which is severalfold. First of all, things are never as simple as they seem. They are never as clear-cut as we humans either want them to be or pretend that they are. We are prone to, this is good and this is horrible judgments. But nature and humanity are enormously more complex than that. Life is enormously more complex than that. Secondly, we are prone to make decisions based on how convenient or comfortable a given situation is to us personally. If we have a fear of spiders, all spiders are bad. If we don't understand another person's culture, religion, upbringing, we can't relate. And it's easier to dismiss those people because we are uneasy. If it's not pleasant, we'd rather not focus on it. We'd rather focus on something else. And thirdly, we humans are so quick to render judgment about each other and our actions. From, how can you plant that? It's invasive, to, how can she eat that? It's full of fat or carbs or chemicals, right? To, why does he look, act, speak, drive like that? And we do this more and more quickly without data, information, or self-examination. If someone posts a photo of a new color of Rudbeckia or Echinacea on social media, they will quickly get slapped for their interest as people scold them for something that isn't attractive to native bees. Even if those who are doing the scolding have no idea what other native pollinator support plants are in that poster's garden. If someone expresses interest in a plant that spreads quickly, somebody else is sure to plant shame them for liking an aggressive plant without knowing whether that overly vigorous plant is native or how that gardener intends to contain it. We humans are really good at making assumptions. We are really good at assuming that an aggressively growing plant is invasive, or assuming that we are doing everything possible to protect pollinators. We think that being able to count sheep is enough, even if the truth is we can't tell a sheep from a dog. We should all be challenged to ask what's truly invasive in our lives instead of rushing to judgment about other people. Is fear fueling our opinions and actions way too aggressively? And which of those spreads so quickly in us that it chokes out our native goodness? Where do our assumptions, what we think we know, pull us away from being what is true and truly important? Let's instead be ready to recognize and cultivate our native abilities for life-affirming creativity, intelligence, and caring. Let's toss the quick condemnations without information into the weed pile and compost our assumptions so that we can grow better things.